First of all, thank you, Chair and committee members. The Centre for Policy Development is grateful for the opportunity to participate in your public hearings. I'd also like to start by acknowledging that we're meeting on Wurundjeri land and pay my respects to Elders past, present, and to extend that respect to any First Nations people here with us today. CPD is a non-partisan independent policy institute. We create, connect and convince on long-term policy challenges and opportunities facing Australia and the region. Supporting effective government and service delivery systems has been a core part of CPD's work since our founding in 2007. Our work on early childhood development grew from that work starting in 2020. As our submission outlines, most of CPD's work in relation to the inquiry's terms of reference concerns the impact of combining work and care on young children and families, and the need for holistic reform to transform Australians' experience of raising a family and managing paid work at the same time. So our work on early childhood development has included 2 reports on the evidence for universal early childhood system and how it could be implemented in Australia. CPD has also established a council on early childhood development. To support this work, the council brings together senior leaders from the early childhood sector, business, academia, unions and all Australian jurisdictions. We work in close collaboration with many of the actors in the sector. We note a number of members of our council and other partners have also provided submissions to this inquiry, of course, including SNAKE, Early Childhood Australia, the Parenthood, the Front Project and many others. Our work has highlighted the inadequacy of current support systems for parents to combine work and care responsibilities and for young children and families to thrive. The early childhood development system should be considered an essential element of Australia's social and economic infrastructure, but it's not traditionally been treated as such. While we have strong foundations to build on, there is wide variation in service systems, different starting points for reform across jurisdictions and critical gaps in quality, access, service provision and workforce supply. Insufficient attention is paid to how all the parts fit together, which means we're missing opportunities to support the well-being of all young children and parents at a really critical time of life. Our report, Starting Better, proposes a national guarantee for young children and families. This is a universal entitlement that would be a new pillar of Australia's social deal, much like Medicare and the school system. The guarantee would entitle every child and their family to more paid parental leave, 3 days of free or low-cost, high-quality early childhood education and care a week, from birth until school, a stronger maternal and child health system, smoother transitions to school and more integrated services. The guarantee would transform families' experiences of combining work and care in the early years of a child's life. As outlined in our submission, we recommend adopting the guarantee for young children and families in full. We would, however, like to draw the committee's attention to 3 key components of the guarantee that are particularly relevant to supporting combined work and care. Firstly, we recommend extending paid parental leave to up to 12 months per family, with incentive for leaves to be shared between partners. Australia's current scheme makes it difficult for individuals to meaningfully engage in work while raising young children, creating negative impacts over the short and the long term. It contributes to many mothers leaving the workforce for extended periods. The workforce participation rate of mothers with children aged birth to 5 is 28% below fathers, and a lower participation rate persists after their children start school. Paid parental leave of up to 1 year increases the likelihood of mothers returning to their job because they maintain a connection to their employer. Shared leave has also been found to improve child well-being, reduce parenting stress and foster lasting equality in the household division of care responsibilities. A Swedish study found that for each month a father stays on parental leave, maternal earnings increase by 6.7%. Shared leave would mean that more women stay in work while raising a family, improving earnings, female workforce participation and gender equality. The second element, we'd want to emphasise the role of universal early childhood education and care in fostering the wellbeing and development of young children and supporting parents to manage work and care. A universal approach will clarify, simplify and amplify public expectations for children's early years. Universal services provide a lower barrier to entry and a soft entry point to more targeted services. They are the best way to benefit children and families who need them most. Making early childhood education and care universal is also the best way to improve gender equity and labour force participation. Our latest report, Starting Now, recommends priorities to move towards universal early childhood education and care as a backbone of a well-connected early childhood development system. This includes action to improve the affordability and accessibility of high-quality early childhood services and making sure that we have the early childhood professionals to deliver them. Finally, we want to stress that reforms to the early childhood development system need to be approached holistically. As our submission outlines, each element is integrated and expands the impact of other parts of the system. For example, providing families with 1 year of paid parental leave would reduce demand for places in early childhood education and care for our very youngest children. Holistic reform will have major benefits for Australia's economy and society. In Starting Better, we estimate that when fully implemented, the guarantee would deliver tax and savings benefits of approximately $5 billion per annum, and this would increase over time as the full benefits flow through. We also estimate GDP increase of up to $10 billion per annum. The levers to address these challenges don't, however, sit with one portfolio, and they don't rest with one level of government. Commonwealth, states, territories should have joint responsibility to steward and deliver a universal child-focused system. If we're going to get the most out of our investment in the early years and genuinely improve our work and care systems, we need a new approach involving collective ownership, effort and accountability. Thank you very much. We're really happy to answer any questions that you've got.
I'm wondering, would you like to go first then? You're good? Okay. Or maybe I'll go first this time. I'm just curious, sitting here today, we've heard a lot of very rich evidence from a range of people, and I'd say there's a lot of agreement across what we're hearing around the gaps and challenges in our early childhood education care system in particular, but also around paid parental leave. And I'm wondering, your researchers, what's your view about how we've landed where we are as a country with this many gaps and challenges for our most vulnerable children and for our carers?
It's a big question.
It's a big question.
To
I
start.
just invite you to. Yeah. I'm curious about quite where we're a country that led the world on many industrial conditions, on controlling hours of work, for example, and yet we have a very frayed work and care system.
Yeah.
I think there's probably, I would respond with two things that come immediately to mind. One is the Commonwealth-state split. It doesn't engender integration and cooperation, and there's once upon a time there was a sort of a childcare responsibility that's rested with the Commonwealth, and there was an early learning responsibility that rested with the states and territories, and in some ways that might have worked for a period of time, but as those systems have become more integrated in the services and in the way families experience them, it hasn't matched in the Commonwealth-state relationships as well. So that's why Annabelle has said we really think that you need to look at the Commonwealth-state responsibility and investment together. Capital investment, recurrent investment, the whole thing has to be in a much more integrated way. The other thing I would say is also with childcare, it was seen as a measure around workforce participation, whereas now understandings of brain development for children in the 0 to 5, we absolutely understand the importance of those early years. And so you have a policy objective that's very much about child development and workforce participation, but we don't have the system systems that equally privilege both of those things. You heard a moment ago from Snake that it really privileges, with the activity test, it's about whether you agree that it's actually delivering that, but it's about workforce participation. It's really privileging that in the funding model, and not, if you were holding both of those things equally, you would fund it in a different way so that you've got through those outcomes. And I think because it's traditionally and historically been about workforce participation, it hasn't really caught up with where we now understand sort of the importance of development in those early years. So I think those two things are the...
So you're pointing to systems of governance that are fractured across federal, state, local, and goals for some of our systems, notably early childhood, which don't really pick up what we now know to be important from the science, for example, on brain development and our children, and the science of inequality as well.
And I think that they, as a, government's policy objective does pick those two up, but we've sort of lagged in terms of the funding model and the approaches and the service delivery that actually lags those changes. And so we've really got to pick that, we've got to think about it with those two in mind as well. So.
Yeah, I would just add that I think now, of course, we're starting to see those policy objectives of a universal system, a more joined-up system, a child-focused system. We're seeing those really come through. But in terms of the funding model for the system, what we actually have is the Commonwealth sending money to parents so the parents can buy a service. So that's a long way from the Commonwealth's understanding the Commonwealth's role as being a joint steward and funder of a service system, of an integrated service system. It's quite a few steps away.
Okay. I'll allow myself one more question before handing to Senator White. How do you rate or compare where we sit on this range of policies that you've talked about as the key pillars relative to our the OECD, for example?
Not well. No. I think that's probably the short answer. I mean, it depends on each of the sort of aspects of all of the sort of suite of supports and services. But when you look at things like the OECD average for parental leave is 51 weeks. We rate out of sort of like out-of-pocket expenses, we're very poorly for early childhood education and care. We're well below OECD average. I think UNICEF's rates sort of, and I can get these stats to you, 35 out of 42 countries in terms of access and affordability of early childhood education and care. So we don't rate well on those, comparatively with OECD.
And do you have a sense about how much more we would need to spend, for example, because I think many of us think about how do we pay for this, to reach kind of the average or best OECD levels on early childhood and paid parental leave and a better work care regime?
So we costed the full suite of the guarantee in Starting Better, and there's a really detailed cost-benefit analysis in that. And the thing that we also did was phased the reforms because, of course, there is a significant investment in addition to what's already a fairly significant investment in these systems. There's no doubt about that. But it's a phase form, and to allow also for the fact that there are returns on that investment that are immediate in terms of workforce participation, tax and savings benefits, but also long-term for child development outcomes, and what we know from international studies about the return on investment from quality early childhood education and care. So we've got a figure, if you just bear with me. What we have estimated in terms of additional annual investment is between $10 and $19 billion. That's once the guarantee is fully rolled out. But as I said, we've phased elements like paid parental leave, first phase at 26 weeks, a second phase at 8 weeks, before you then moved a longer term and fairly bold reform to 52 weeks. And similarly, we've proposed phasing in the universal entitlement to early childhood education and care. That would be free or low cost. I would say, though, it doesn't account for
I was just going to say,
what we've seen from recently, the Commonwealth's investments in proposed investment around the early childhood education and care subsidies, but also New South Wales and Victoria's recent announcements, which are about $30 billion all up in those announcements to improve affordability and accessibility of early childhood education and care. So that hasn't been factored into those costings because we did.
How much is that $30 billion spending?
It's a bit different. So some of them are over 4 years. The New South Wales has announced a childcare, sort of an affordability fund, and that's $5 billion over 10 years. And I make that point because it's it's a fairly significant investment in long day care provision, which has traditionally been a Commonwealth responsibility, but they're slightly different periods of time.
I think the other thing to say about cost and funding is that each element of this system sort of impacts the others. So we've looked at the guarantee as a holistic suite of reforms that we say need to be done in an integrated way, because they actually support each other in terms of cost, rather than, I think, if you attack them in a sort of segmented way, which is what we've seen, then you see a lot of waste and overlap, and those sorts and investments not supporting each other. So hence the idea about more holistic approach.
Thank you. Senator White.
I think it's interesting the point you make about the system having been about workforce participation, and now we're suddenly realising it's actually a bit more about education. Do you think that also, I guess, explains, I use that word because I can't think of anything else, explains the undervaluation of the work of the women that are in the sector? That is, they were really childminders, not educators, the way in which it had been looked at. Do you think that's a...
Yeah, look, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think we all understand that care has been majorly undervalued across many parts of Australian society and the economy. So, absolutely, I think, I guess there's an inherent bias within that kind of funding model and system that that favours women in the workforce over and above women with their children and caring for their children. So yes, in that respect. But I think the care workforces overall have been traditionally undervalued. Absolutely.
It sort of amazes me that a 4-year degree in engineering that builds a bridge probably gets 4 times more money than a person who looks after a child, who educates a child and in their formative years. Well, it seems slightly odd to me in terms of priority.
Not to mention the people that look after our money and how much they get paid, right?
We heard about that this morning.
Classifications this morning on the evidence.
Well, that's right. Well, my other example is a money market deal would probably earn 10 times what I earn.
I think your point, though, Senator, right, in the sense of it hasn't caught up with our understanding of those that 0 to 5 in terms of brain development and how critical the child development system is at that point. And you can see that when you look at the workforce, the early childhood teaching workforce, and the difference in the pay conditions for the early childhood teaching workforce compared to the school system. So obviously not, for some jurisdictions, the preschool provision is in the school system, but for a lot of them, it's outside of the school system, and there is that real distinction.
So you also mentioned in your opening statement about providing incentives to get more blokes to take parental leave. So we did hear from Sweden this morning, and surprisingly, despite their scheme, it seemed to be incentivising men to take the leave, to take parental leave. Only 30% of the total amounts of leave available were taken up by men. What do we have to do to men? And what incentives are you talking about? Are you talking incentives? Well, I understand that, but are we talking incentives or are we talking big sticks? We haven't got too many men in here, so go for it. Go for it.
Well, I think
seeing as they're not engaged, we can say what we like. What do you think?
I'm not sure if you went into this sort of nuance with the sweets this morning, but I think one of the things that we've built into the guarantee, and we say in our submission, is that the sort of use it or lose it weeks seem to make a real difference in shifting that behaviour. So just making it available obviously is very important, and incentivising shared care, but if you actually if they lose it as a family, if the father or the second partner doesn't take it, that can shift the behaviour change that we're looking for. Understanding that behaviour change it's a long-term shift, as I'm sure we all know.
The other aspect is, I think research has found that if the income replacement isn't close to sort of the pre-birth wage, then fathers are less likely to take it.
And just on the federation,
Fix the federation.
yeah, fix the federation. I'm asking all the big questions. So it is a hodgepodge, isn't it? Really, of things, and it seems like it's quite hard to figure out what the differences are between, because there are large announcements. I take it from what you're saying, you're advocating that everybody's got to put all their money in a big pool and come up with the same scheme. Is that what you're saying?
We're not advocating pooled funding necessarily, no.
Put it all together and it's
Understand.
all
Under one agreement, effectively.
Yeah, look, I think if we're really talking about a universal system, high quality, affordable, accessible to every Australian child, regardless of their circumstance or location, then that's a joint effort. It's a joint effort between states, territories, Commonwealth, and actually local government. Yeah. So it needs to be addressed in that way. I think if we're talking about a universal system, but we're still thinking about it simply as the Commonwealth sort of changing its funding through the childcare subsidy, it's simply not going to get there without the states and territories also building up their part of the service system. And really, so that's the long and the short of it. It's just not achievable if it's not understood as a joint effort. So we've suggested in starting now that it's essentially a joint design process between the Commonwealth, states and territories to work through all of the thorny issues of delivering where there are thin markets, workforce strategy, building up a sustainable workforce, those things that we know are critical to delivering that universal system.
The other thing I would just add is, in some ways it's more complicated than funding hospitals and funding schools, because of the way the system has and the service provision has sort of developed differently in different jurisdictions. So if you look at preschool, so if you just think about where children in their year before school get access to their preschool program, looks tough across the country. You might, for the Eastern Seaboard, which is more of a mixed market model, you're much more likely to be receiving your preschool program in a long day care. You're in front of an early childhood teacher and you're getting your preschool program, but it's in a long day care service. If you're in Western Australia or South Australia and the other states, it's much more likely that it's in the school system. So it's a preschool, but it's offered through the school system. Now, I'm not saying the outcomes are necessarily better or worse in either of those systems, but it's a very different system. And also in cross jurisdictions, even when you look at, say, between New South Wales and Victoria and Queensland, the split between sort of community preschool provision versus long day care, private and not-for-profit, those sorts of things, looks very different. So it's not to say you can't sort of resolve that to improve access and affordability, but it just means that you're starting from a very complicated base.
Yeah, and as you said, local government's in the fray as well. They're in it in some states, but not in others. Absolutely, yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Sandra O'Neill.
I'm just exhausted thinking about the scale of the task, which is not what we. Yes, I need to.
We don't want to exhaust
later. Yeah. So, look, can I thank you for your submission and your work? I mean, the detail is quite remarkable. Not very often do we get a submission. I just go to page 7 of the second part of it, where you've got the blueprint for implementation. You know, like it's a follow the bouncing ball, and if you do this, it'll all come together. And you know, as you indicated in your evidence today, you know that you've got the 12 months foundation, transition, and then at scale by 2030. I do appreciate the detail, and I'm very impressed by how you've put the numbers into this, which gives some, you know, some fullness to what might need to be considered. But I just wonder if the ask that you have, given we've talked about health and education, these are historical realities where, you know, at the best of times things have been advanced, and we can see from the outcomes in education that Australia is going backwards. We've seen what happened with, you know, healthcare and the challenges. There are massive changes that had to happen to provide support. Is 2030 at all a plausible timeline? Because that's what you've used to construct your argument, and I just don't see how that can be delivered. So as much as I delight in the information, I really question, you know, the possibility of it being advanced, even if everything lined up in the way that you've articulated here.
Yes, it's a really good point, and I think there's device in that. You know, there's I think what we really wanted to get across was this is a reform as significant as Medicare. It's a values
proposition.
It's nation building in the same way. And we wanted to really shift the dial on how early childhood and the early years were understood in the Australian society and the economy. And so we put the light on the hill and said, this is a big scale reform. You know, it's a 10-year proposition, but it's absolutely worth it. But it needs to be thought about in that way, in the same way that, you know, reforming the healthcare system was thought about. And so I suppose that's the strategic goal, if you like. And just to say that, I mean, since writing Starting Better, we've actually seen many of the pieces being put into place. I mean, since writing Starting Better, it was very instrumental in the New South Wales budget and the Treasurer's announcements about the investments into early childhood. It also supported the Victorian announcements into early childhood. I mean, they've been described as the largest reform since the gun control. We've also seen the First Ministers at their most recent National Cabinet meeting also commit to these sorts of joined up reform efforts. So yes, it's absolutely ambitious. Yes, 10 years might be pushing it, but I think it's really is just making that case for grand nation-building reform that we absolutely believe that this is.
So, Chair, if I've got time for a couple more questions, thank you. You provide incredibly powerful evidence that I think would capture the public imaginary if we could get it out. You talk about the benefit of inputs in terms of children's additional earnings based on 1 year of quality preschool, and you cite evidence of $1.7 billion in tax revenue. And that was from the front project, Smart Investment in Smarter Australia. That's just one in terms of productivity gain. You cite 1.1 billion reduction in crime-related expenditure based on 1 year of quality preschool. I'm just sort of stretching here for, when you come to further evidence of benefits for family, again, the same sorts of comparative analyses with numbers attached. But you go to one of the critical issues that I think is, for me, really significant here, is the mental health angle of this. Now, Australians have developed a literacy about mental health, there is still stigma, but I think we could all say that it's gradually declining. We still have, suicide ideation at extremely high levels, some of it COVID related, but more. But in here you talk about, in Australia, access to PPL reduces the likelihood of maternal depression. Maternal depression by 14%, increasing to 18.5% action if the mother's partner accesses dad and partner pay. That's a pretty significant claim. I want to understand your confidence in the claims that you're making in this and the methodology that you've applied, because I'm reading all the things I want to hear and see.
The benefits are really drawn from sort of national and international studies about the impact, where it has actually been applied and the impact that it's had. So it draws on those studies. We can certainly get you some more
extrapolations just based on a hope and a wing and a hope and a prayer. This has been proven as a public policy outcome by this level of investment in a particular jurisdiction.
So depending on which element of it, and so there is extrapolation to the extent of this is the experience that it's had in this jurisdiction. There's the economic modelling on the early childhood education and care benefits that are also, we've applied that same economic modelling that the Front Project has provided to you in their submission of every dollar you spend, the return that you get. So the evidence around the maternal mental health are drawn from international studies where that's been applied and where they've shown those benefits. And so we're making assumptions that you would then get those same benefits flowing through if we were to apply the same paid parental leave example in Australia, that you would get those same benefits.
You talked about the complex intersection of so many parts of public policy. It all needs to come together, and we're only attending to one or the other. Could I ask you to take on notice the SDA-sponsored report out of the University of New South Wales and the data that's in there, because what you're describing here, as much as it has appealed to me, needs to be considered in the context of what kind of work women are going to be able to do, right? And one of the arguments that was put forward is that in this feminised workforce that women are going into, there might be an overstatement of productivity gain because really they're getting such incredibly poor wages. The other thing is the tyranny of management control of access to hours, the nature of the insecure work. Because I think that what's becoming apparent to me as we go on through the day is that there's the shape of a university graduate in a stable and secure workplace that's embedded in much of the figure work that's been done. And then there's the reality of women in the feminised industries providing care, trying to balance care, trying to do early child care as well as aged care, that complex intersection of paid and unpaid care, and they're not going into any kind of work that is secure. So that affects our figures, it affects our predictions, and there's an IR dimension to this that seems enormous. It's not just about early childhood provision.
Yeah.
It's about when that early childhood care is provided, even in this, really sort of almost utopian way. Where does that leave women still?
Yeah, absolutely. And we will take that on notice and have a better look at that connection. I think that's why we also make the point, and we don't feel as though we're in the best position to really take on that kind of workforce angle or part of this, although we think it's critically important, but we know that there are better organisations out there doing that work.
Yeah.
But
I guess because the productivity gains that are banked
yes.
have to be real in the context of the jurisdiction
Yes.
of
Within
Australia,
the context, yeah.
with where we are currently with the
those
level
workforces.
of pay in those workforces where these women we're talking about are going to be supposedly enabled to participate now.
I would also just say it's, the New South Wales Treasury's Women's Economic Opportunities Review also, they did their own modelling And they also said that the biggest thing that you could do, the major reform to improve women's workforce participation and get the gains that we're talking about is to improve early childhood education and care. Now, their modelling was looking at New South Wales data, and so I think there is. It's not just, we haven't just absorbed what's happening internationally and sort of plonk it down to, as you say, an industrial relations landscape and a care landscape that looks very different. So there's those sort of, the modelling that New South Wales Treasury has done is based on looking at the sort of New South Wales industrial landscape and what they're actually, the assumptions they're making. So they have certainly seen that early childhood education and care would get you those improvements to workforce participation as well. But we'll happily take on notice, have a look at that report and come back to you with those assumptions as well.
Well, I think participation has to be framed in that if 3 hours casual work is sufficient enough to actually give it that name, because what does 3 hours work do?
Well, I think also it's making that point that these early childhood development system reforms go hand in hand with development of a sustainable, well remunerated, valued workforce.
For the children who would access it?
That is critically important in children's outcomes, yes, but also just for the workforce themselves, and of course it's a highly feminised, undervalued, underpaid workforce. So it's understanding that these sorts of reforms can't come off the back of an undervalued workforce. They've got to go hand in hand with improving the lot of that workforce at the same time, as well as workforces across the care industries.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for all of the detail that you've given us, and it's very helpful to us. We are receiving other evidence this afternoon, and we had some this morning, but which goes to this other sphere of workplace relations and how the world of work works. I mean, we don't want Rolls-Royce paid parental leave and Rolls-Royce early childhood education, which sends home exhausted mothers who've had to juggle shifts and been underpaid to take their stress home to their children. We certainly heard that this morning, for example, from the retail sector and the care sector itself. One of the things that your contribution makes me reflect on is the parallel, in a way, of the level of reform required is similar to the climate change challenge, in a way. I mean, they're both existential in a way, but you say 10 billion up to 19 billion annually if we were going to do the ambitious Light on the Hill proposal you give us. Well, Treasury tells us that we spend $11 billion subsidising fossil fuel at the moment. There are possibilities within our budget which perhaps don't make this quite as distant a light as it might be. Thank you so much, and you've really laid out a very strong case around early childhood education, care and paid parental leave. Just a little question on paid parental leave. You've gone for 52 weeks as your goal. I'm assuming you're also including superannuation on that, and the portion you've argued for a use it or lose it. How do you see the benefit between a 26-week provision and 52? What would it give the Australian community that it doesn't get with half a year?
The research, sort of the international evidence, shows that you get the greater benefit when you have a longer period of leave. And I think the scenario that we've got in terms of the 52 weeks is not just that it's longer period, but also that you are getting closer to a pre-birth replacement wage. So it's really about those two pieces coming together at that point. So it's quite a, that's quite a significant scheme in effect at that point as well. We've modelled sort of additional, both additional sort of the weeks and the cost for that, but also additional take up as it become more generous scheme, but at that 52 weeks where we think you get the biggest benefit and it matches the OECD average of 51.5, that's when you would sort of get the benefit of the sort of the family well-being and child well-being as well.
We heard a strong argument this morning from the Shop Assistants Union about maintaining the bottom minimum wage level with income replacement beyond that up to a possible cap. Are you in support of that minimum wage as a base?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And we've sort of factored in the way we've factored it in for the in starting better is about an employer contribution as well. So thinking about how that might work as part of that.
Replacement wage. It's a minimum wage.
What we've modelled in starting better is a sort of about 80%. That you would then, but it would be both the government contribution and an employer contribution, so it would be both of those sort of things. So it's a slightly different model than what you were given this morning, but it's the same sort of intent.
But with a minimum wage for those who are earning less than.
Yes.
So
Yeah, minimum wage.
80% of $263
No, 80% of ordinary earnings
is very much
replacement. Thank you. Thanks so much for your appearance today, for all the documentation you've given us. And if you've taken any questions on notice, we'd appreciate your answers by the 4th of October, if possible. We're now going to suspend for 10 minutes, but thank you so much for your time and effort.
Thank you.